Hello, I'm Dr. Amanda Nell Edgar. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and Film here at the University of Memphis, and my research and teaching discusses communication in terms of media, popular culture, and rhetoric. One of the things that I notice most consistently when I talk to students in my media and information literacy course is that they have a lot of concerns about social media, particularly social media on smartphones. It's really no wonder. A lot of the information that we hear about smartphones really emphasizes the dangers of smartphones in terms of depression, loneliness, and social isolation. And I actually noticed that your textbook does this as well. It gives some great information on studies that support the harmful potential of smartphones and social media. But it doesn't give us much context to think about how technology has historically been understood as something that we should be afraid of, rather than really balancing and contextualizing the way that social media can work for both harm and good in our life. In this short lecture, I want to talk about a few ways of understanding social media use and research about social media use. First, I'll place social media and smartphones into the context of historical technopanics. Second, I'll highlight some of the problems with framing social media smartphone research as conclusively negative. And finally, I'll offer some observations from social media research from our own department that demonstrate the ways social media can actually help us feel supported in our lives, and particularly in the fight for social change. So first of all, what are technopanics? Technopanics are fears that a particular new technology will bring about the collapse of society, usually in terms of cultural morals and values. To offer an example of what technopanics sound like, we can turn to this quote from cultural commentator Tom Standage. Standage wrote, "New technology has poisoned the mind and corrupted the morals of many a promising youth, and prevented others from improving their minds in useful knowledge." What could Standage have been talking about? Maybe violent video games or movies, or maybe internet pornography or cyber stalking. Actually, Tom Standage was writing in 1790, and he was writing about the printing press. Standage worried that youth had too much access to things like plays and novels, and he was worried that this was going to lead them to leave behind their values and morals that were rooted in attending public gathering spaces like churches. In fact, we've seen this type of technopanic play out over and over again over history, not only with things like the printing press, but things like car radios, the access to movies in the late 1800s, and then more contemporary examples such as television, video games, and social media. But there's a long history of issues of technopanic, and we have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how studies of new technologies might frame their potential effects. And in fact, this is important because anytime we're gathering new research, it's really important to be aware of the contexts that might bias us or lead us to believe things that haven't fully been proven. And in fact, the next point I want to make is that we need to be careful when we think of new research on social media as conclusively negative. If you set out to make the case that smartphone social media use has negative mental health effects, you can certainly do that. But, as Dr. Sarah Rose Kavanaugh points out, to do so, you'd have to ignore all of the studies that conclusively showed no link between smartphone social media use and depression and isolation, as well as those that showed a link between smartphone social media use and positive social outcomes such as resilience. So how can all of this be true? A lot of it leans on the fact that correlation does not equal causation. Most of us have heard that before, but what exactly does it mean? Well, first, correlation simply means that as one variable rises or falls, other variables also rise or fall in relationship to that first variable. So for example, what if a researcher finds that as social media smartphone use increases over time, there are also increases in indicators of depression and social isolation? Some people, particularly those who are looking at this data through the lens of a technopanic, might believe that this means smartphone social media causes depression. But remember, a correlation does not equal a causation. We don't know which one happened first in this case, right? We only know that they're moving at the same time. So an equally plausible explanation might be that as people grew more depressed and socially isolated, they turned to their phone more. That makes sense, right? If you don't feel like you can get out of bed, maybe your phone's right there. It's all you feel like you can do. And in fact, studies show that this is true, that actually social isolation and depression can cause increases in smartphone social media use, not necessarily the other way around. A third explanation is that this is actually a spurious relationship. A spurious relationship simply means that there's a third variable that we didn't think to measure that's affecting the other two variables. So while it may look as though one variable causes the other, there's actually a third that's causing them both. For example, a global pandemic might increase both symptoms and indicators of depression and social isolation. And because we're social distancing, it also might increase our smartphone social media use. In that case, the pandemic is our spurious variable that's causing both of our other two variables to move. And that makes it false to conclude that there's a causality just because there's a correlation between social isolation and depression and smartphone social media use. In fact, a lot of times we find that this is the case. Because smartphone social media research is so relatively new, we don't really conclusively know much at all. But what happens sometimes is we tend to interpret the results of our data through this lens of technopanic. If we're afraid that smartphones are about to bring about social collapse, it makes sense that we would do that, but it doesn't make it good science. And in fact, we have plenty of research to show that smartphone social media use can actually be a really positive social indicator. In fact, research in our own department has shown that smartphone social media use can actually contribute to our sense of community, particularly when we're thinking about working towards making a more just and equitable society. To give a couple examples, my 2018 book with Dr. Andre Johnson, The Struggle Over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, showed that people used social media to reach out to community to learn about social justice and to find others who felt the same way, even and particularly when they felt isolated from others in their in-person community. This has been shown time and time again on platforms like Facebook and particularly YouTube comment sections, where my research in 2016 and 2019 showed that people were often drawn to fan communities, where other people who had the same types of identities, the same types of interests, and the same types of experience were able to find each other, particularly on fan-based YouTube sites that weren't as widely shared over social media and in the general public. So I hope that this talk has given you a little bit of context on the ways that we can think of social media and smartphone use, not as necessarily harmful, but as a work in progress. We know that certainly there are some negative effects of smartphone and social media use, but there are also some positive effects. And really, in some, it's all just too new to really know. We're still working to learn and discover new things about what it might mean to use our smartphones and to use social media to build communities, for better or for worse. But I hope you'll realize that what's important is that we look at what the science tells us. We look at research and try to figure out what we're seeing in our patterns of our society, not looking through the historical lens of technopanics.